Monica, thank you so much for joining me. It's lovely to have you here. And I've ruined your wonderful image, anybody watching on video, because I've made you put headphones on. And yet your hair is so funky. So we've just flattened your hair today, which is just criminal.
It's okay.
It's okay. So tell me, let's just dive straight in. What does being a futurist mean to you?
So I think I have quite a different concept of what being a futurist is compared to what futurists are or do in industry. So to start with, well, most futurists are men. There aren't that many women. Most futurists come from sort of very Western perspective. And most futurists are sort of very much anchored in sort of Silicon Valley ideology, which I sort of call more of a gadgetism rather than futurism. So for me, being a futurist is really thinking about our future on a planetary scale, meaning really global future, really looking at every sort of nooks and corners of the earth and trying to understand where the future is going there. And really thinking both technological and scientific, but also political, cultural, social innovations together inextricably. And in my personal practice, I am really, really focused on how scientific research and technological development affects politics and culture, and in turn, how our politics and culture affects the kind of science and technology that we do. So that feedback loop is very, very important for me. And then I guess another aspect to what I do is that I'm not just a futurist, I'm also a future designer. Future designer in the field of sort of science fiction, storytelling, story world design, prototyping, etc. So for me, it's also very important to think, what is that relationship between the real futures that we do and the futures that we dream in a format of entertainment, edutainment, etc. What is that sort of future imagination that we have and how it ultimately takes or does not take us somewhere? So I guess that's what futurism is for me. And in a way, because of my background and also because of where I do my research, which is mostly my biggest focus is Global South, as much as I do spend time, of course, in Silicon Valley. And, here we're doing this podcast in London, going to China and Beijing, Shenzhen next month, coming from Japan. But it is very, very important for me to take in all of the perspectives and really filter them through that global prism, rather than bring it back to just my own culture and say that that is the world.
Lovely, yeah. That's beautiful. So tell me, is this why you became a digital nomad? Because this is how you describe yourself, as a full-time digital. So tell us what that means in reality on a day-to-day. Because you're in London today, but where could you be? Where do you live?
So I do have official residency and an official address, but that's I basically have not really lived anywhere for the past 7 years. And since I'm 17, which is half of my life ago, I have not really spent anywhere longer than 2 months. Even when I had a fixed base, I was traveling at least half of the time. So I've been working and researching in 90 countries right now, something like that, and counting. And it's not just sort of going in and checking in, oh, I've been there, but really spending time with people, having deep conversations, doing projects, collaborations, and really just sort of diving into what people's lives is about. From, again, having conversations with the top sort of researchers in the fields of science and technology, but also with the kids on the street and also older people, and sort of peeling off as well those cultural and political layers to understand how, again, that would influence where the future is going in those particular places. So indeed, as a digital nomad, I am full-time on road. And why I started doing that, there were personal reasons to it as well. But also like, I think a huge thing was that if I was speaking about the future, I had to walk the talk. Where I speak about the future where access becomes more important than ownership, then can I really experience that and understand what are sort of the benefits and what are the failures therein? I guess the important thing when you live as a digital nomad, that whichever place that you're in, you're not just visiting, you're not just a tourist. You actually, for those few days or a week or 2 weeks or 2 months, you truly immerse yourself in the place. So you try to do everything as people in that place do, and really be an inhabitant of that city or of that region. And I think through that, the kind of conversations you end up having, the kind of things that you end up noticing, is nothing at all like what you could collect just browsing the internet, which unfortunately is how most people, even in our field, are doing their research. So for me, of course, it's a combination. There's a lot of reading and keeping in touch with everything that's happening globally, but being in the place and really physically spending time with people, for me, is the only way, to go under the skin of sort of what is the surface conversation.
So it's interesting, really, because I mean, the majority of your time has been spent looking at the future of content, but yet you're talking here about understanding other civilizations going around the world. So sort of it's like a zoom in, zoom out. Is that important for you and your work?
Yeah, so I actually often, when people ask me how it all started, I go a little bit into my personal story. And I was born behind the Iron Curtain. I was born into a dictatorship, what is now called Lithuania. Back then, we were part of Soviet Union, and people couldn't travel. People couldn't travel. Could not even imagine traveling. We were really behind the curtain, and even within, each of our sort of countries, people could not move. Soviet Union was very big, but people could not move freely even within the Union. So what really opened my mind as my geography teacher, and as I was 12-year-old girl. She hadn't had the chance to travel and see the world, but the way she was speaking about the world made me realize that to understand any particular place, or even any one individual within a place, you need to understand so much, from geography to geology to political history to cultural history, etc., 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 climate. So all of these things factor in, so you can understand, even that little piece that you are talking about, that individual that you're exchanging with. And of course, complete understanding is impossible, but to approach it, right? And I think because she managed to open my eyes to this kind of way of seeing the world, I kind of translated it into everything that I did. And even if today my focus is really the future of content, where we're going with how we're going to be producing and consuming information and what knowledge ultimately means. But this specific area, I think you can only understand if you understand everything else around it, right? So even if that is my field of expertise, I'm trying to scope in and look into everything that shapes our culture, because the kind of information that we produce, the kind of information that we want to consume, and where the computation is going, right? Where we're going with immersive media technology, artificial intelligence, you cannot understand if you do not have that broader cultural and geopolitical reading of what is our future, what are our future cities. And I think maybe in that way as well, I differ slightly from what is the dominant trend within futurism that is specifically sort of gadget and just uniquely technology focused. The way I view technologies is just a tool. It's just a tool. And of course, the tool allows us to do certain things, but it is our culture, it is our wishes, it is our desires that really factor in more than anything in how we use those tools. And also, what will be the next tools that we will be developing.
You are so passionate about your topic. I love it. It's wonderful to talk to you about it. You mentioned having a vision for future of cities. Could you tell me a little bit more about what your vision is for the future of cities?
Yeah, so again, I feel that we have this very mainstream idea, what is progress and what is development. And we've sort of penned it to the notion of first world, second world, third world, developed, developing, underdeveloped world. And I think that those notions are fracturing apart because, very simple examples. In Japan, right? There are a lot of, you have smart toilets that, that, is your most technologically advanced toilet experience. And lots of, dancing robots and robot cafes and lots of gadgets like that. At the same time, when you are taking public transport, you cannot pay for it with your credit card. Right, and mobile money does not even really exist at all in the mainstream usage. Now, you go to places like Kenya and Rwanda, they are so much more advanced in their sort of mobile money usage and everything that it allows people. And most people don't even carry cash anymore in places like Kenya, right? So, it becomes much more difficult for people to say that, this one world is developed and the other world is completely underdeveloped. So this is just a very simple example, but I think the bigger and fundamental question is, especially as we are facing what we call climate change, but really it's a biosphere collapse. We're facing a mass extinction of life on Earth, which could lead to the extinction of our own species. We are realizing that maybe all these development models upon which we built our civilization, upon which we built our cities, are not valid anymore. And even the conversation about sustainability is not really valid anymore because we've done so much damage that we actually need to regenerate. And I think this is a very interesting moment in the conversation of our cities and how do we build the cities to really maybe re-examine if that Western model of sort of very dense skyscraper cities with no nature within them, and also politically, the immense disparity that is created between the megalopolis and then the rural areas around it, which results in what we've seen here in Britain, a radical difference of opinion about Brexit between the Londoners and the surrounding country. And everything that it implies. So I'm very interested in how we might look at other models, especially coming in from the global south, and think, how do we reinvent our cities? How would we deal with cities that are modeled not on places like Copenhagen, because only a tiny fraction of the world lives in places like Copenhagen, but really thinking, what are the real solutions that we find for cities like Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, Mexico City. And I had the chance to work in some of these cities, especially Mexico City, with my brilliant peer, Gabriela Gomez Mont. And it was really thinking, how do we deal with this multi-layered society? How do we deal with all of the issues of the pollution? How do we not demonize that distinction between the high rises and the life on the street, but really bridge those gaps? And how do we do it in a way that also really reconnects the urban and the rural living? Because again, in a lot of those places where the highest density megalopolises exist, also like India, where I spent a lot of time working, these are countries and cities that live in multiple centuries at a time. So how do you not just reconcile that, in a way tolerate that disparity, but how do you embrace it? And how do you see how all of these different lifestyles and modes can contribute to each other rather than be fighting against each other?
And actually, do you think that's the biggest challenge that civilization is facing at the moment? Would you say that's what we really need to resolve?
I think indeed the sort of the fractioning up into the silos It's a real problem. The fact that the biggest stakeholders in the issues do not get involved in the conversation. So, when we're speaking about the future cities, they will be inhabited by future generation. And yet the young people almost never get consulted in the kind of cities that they want to inhabit. So I think bridging those gaps and seeing especially how people that are supporting the right causes from whatever angle, right, from the environmental activism, women's activism, indigenous rights activism, people are working and fighting within their silos, whereas actually we all have a shared stake in that future civilization. So bridging together sort of our shared missions rather than continuing the infighting, I think is the big issue. But more than anything, I think little practical problems we can resolve. The biggest challenge for me is to really have that hopeful vision for our civilization. So the biggest challenge is really to have hope in the future that we imagine. And that hope, it really cannot be in technology. It has to be in our humanity. And as, Naomi Klein's famous book, No is Not Enough, states, the big question is, what are the yeses? So how can we agree on what are the yeses? We need to criticize where things are not working today. We need to see where we've been destructive. How can we become sustainable? And ultimately how we are moving towards being regenerative civilization. But what are those common yeses upon which we can build? And how those common yeses are built within our plurality, rather than, it's Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan and formerly a free software activist, trans woman, one of the most brilliant minds in the field of technology, said, and when we hear the singularity is near, let us remember the plurality is here. And in that sort of poem / prayer / manifest of hers, she very importantly brings our attention how the words matter. Because if we see it for virtual reality, it is hard for us to make it in a shared reality. If we just think of Internet of Things, it's harder for us to translate into Internet of Beings. So sometimes phrasing certain things states an intent and states a goal. And here, a lot of futurism is focused on the upcoming singularity and completely forgets the inherent plurality of our present day. And how can we tap into that rather than wait for some kind of, robot apocalypse? So for me, that's the most important thing, proactively engaged in our plurality and see how it's not just something to tolerate, but really becomes an asset that we can embrace. And how can those future conversations be really brought to the mainstream? So I guess that's my main engagement, is how, after each and every talk of mine, people feel that they learned something new, indeed that they didn't, but also that they see how with whatever that they do, it's not just that little thing that they do. It's not just marketing, it's not just technology, it's not just arts, it's not just media. They are building the culture of the future that we will be inhabiting. So how each of us can understand better and broader the scope of the future towards which we're heading, the issues, the opportunities, and how can we use our own practice to shape the future that we want to inhabit. And I think this is really, really key. Myself and most of my peers, we live at that bleeding edge of the future conversations. So many things that are just hitting the media right now are the conversations we're having 5 years ago. And sometimes when we have conversations between us, I try to remind them that it is hard for the majority of population to catch up with those ideas because they're just not as present, especially in the popular media. So how can we bring those conversations up in the open? How can we help people see how they themselves are the stakeholders in those issues? And I think, here it's a combination of news media that needs to engage with it, and people are curious to hear and understand, where future is heading, what are future issues, what are future technologies. But it's also, where our education needs to shift, and how those conversations about the future need to become part of the public school curriculum. And I believe more than anything, it's our entertainment industry that needs to really upgrade itself into real conversations about the future, rather than just regurgitating some kind of past sci-fi storytelling that does not help us in any way in where we're going, and in fact can become detrimental, because there's so many stories, very important future stories, that they're not telling, and hence we start ignoring them. Laurie Penny, a friend of mine, said that the future is our world is shaped not just by the stories we tell, but also the ones that we don't. I really believe in that, and so my push for the entertainment industry is really, how can we tell stories that are compelling, that are exciting, that are entertaining, that look amazing, but they actually tap into real subject matter that needs to be understood by the majority of population here on Earth.
Wonderful. Fantastic. I'm really encouraged by the fact that you're saying that, we've got to look for common yeses. I think that's a wonderful way of looking at things. And I think it's really important, as you say, to have a hope in the future. I also love the fact that you brought us to the topic of entertainment industry, because I wanted to ask you, and you've led me beautifully into it, about the work you've done with BBC, Universal, DreamWorks. People may not know that you've actually helped design the sci-fi worlds in some incredible films and TV series that we all know and love. Can you tell us a bit more about that work, and how that is important for people to see this kind of imaginative world, and how we then can use it for our real world?
Yes, absolutely. So, that work as a real future, as a future researcher, being on a field, having those conversations, seeing things, then as a futurist, engaging with major, especially technology companies, and seeing, where they are at with their research and development, is very important. But again, I'm a person with a creative background, so that is not enough. I also need to dream, I need to imagine, and I'm also a very visual person. And so that's the side of me that I get to exercise as a world designer on science fiction projects in the entertainment industry. And in a way, it's a feedback loop, because dreaming up fictional futures and really fleshing out what those worlds look like helps me then see from different angles what is happening in real science and technology. And I think also helps me to communicate the ideas to technology companies that are just more sort of visual and more narrative based, and hence become more compelling. But speaking about entertainment industry, so world designer is I guess a term that I coined somewhat myself. It was floating around, and it's a very different role than being just a production designer. So I do not do the production design. I come in very, very early stage in the process when the script is still being written, and I serve as a creative partner, creative collaborator to directors. Sorry, my eyes got smudged. I serve as a creative partner, as a collaborator to directors, in helping them understand how whatever narrative that they have written might need to be changed or affected to be more scientifically, technologically accurate, interesting, etc., etc. And it's really about fleshing out the entire universe where our story is happening. And why is that important? Because most of these projects today, they're not meant to be just one movie or one sort of season of a series, right? We actually create a world, and within that world, stories will be happening. And in a way, each and every medium opens a portal into the world, right? So when you flesh out the world that is sort of self-sustaining, where everything is thought out and everything functions, in a way, it continues happening even when you're not looking at it. And it's much easier then to make movies and video games and any kind of live experiences and pull out merchandise from it. So that's kind of the practical reason why that role is starting to exist. And also because science fiction is becoming a very complex story to tell today. So most of the directors will not have the same understanding of the science and technology, political, social, cultural innovation that we need to embed in our stories to make them at all relevant, especially to the young audiences. And that's kind of really what I helped to do. And some of the projects that I worked on are still in the pipeline, because these are sort of very long duration, because when you come in really, really early stage for a movie that is sort of $100 million and plus in the budget, it takes 4 or 5 years sometimes to come out. And similar with TV series, sometimes a little bit shorter, 3 years. So I have a few very exciting things that are in the pipeline I cannot talk about, but I really tried within them to help the directors, writers, and producers move from sort of the conventional future dystopia towards protopia. And, yes. And I feel very strongly about the notion of protopia and the issues with dystopia. So the main issue with dystopia, we've been telling all these sort of supposedly the warning stories of how things could go wrong. Yet what we've observed is that they have very much become a product roadmap for reality. So sort of the worst ideas and warnings that we put out there of how things could turn terribly wrong, somebody just goes out and is like, that sounds very profitable. What about we go ahead and build it? And there is a real issue with that. And also there's a real issue with our current state sci-fi that again is, in a way, the futurists in the field and people that are telling sci-fi stories have a somewhat similar profile. They're people with not necessarily a very broad cultural scope. They're people that often comes from very privileged backgrounds. And that really can be seen and felt in the type of stories they tell. And sort of the lack of diversity of representation is really staggering. When we can imagine, intergalactic spaceship flights, yet women are still being stuck in that sort of objectified body of definitely less intellectual capability. And that translates in a narrative, that translates into the physical depiction of women in movies, and similarly, men being sort of stuck in sort of toxic masculinity, alpha, male hero sort of stereotype. And then now we're just talking about the two genders. Whereas as we're seeing today, especially in conversation among our youth, we're starting to see gender as a spectrum, right? It's not a binary anymore. We are all fluid and choosing who we actually want to be. And it is not defined anymore by gender, by our passport, nationality, place of birth, skin color. And so fighting against those stereotypes and embedding diversity beyond the boundaries of our physical bodies, of our abilities, seems really crucial for me. And that goes on, I created this whole list of, what dystopia lacks and what protopia has, and it goes into sort of environmental awareness, how we need to see future stories set in a world where we started appreciating that we are completely interconnected with our environment, and we really build cities and technologies, not just to be sustainable, but again, to be regenerative. What does that physically look like? What does that city present itself when I walk through it, when I work in it, right? And it's such an exciting challenge. Then, of course, very important for me, maybe one of the most important areas is youth and street culture. Most of the future imaginations that we have are completely, again, rooted in that singularity vision and do not take into account the emerging subculture, especially, again, the youth's expression of themselves. Actually, I just saw the James Cameron's Alita yesterday. It was one of the first sci-fi movies that kind of started trying to take in youth culture, but it was still very sort of pastiched, and it was not, the youth culture and the youth narrative was not deeply embedded within the story. In a recent conversation, actually, just now in Copenhagen, I met amazing Sudanese documentary filmmaker Hajuj, an artist, Hajuj Kuka. And when I was speaking about the lack of the youth perspectives, he also pointed out to me that the elders' perspectives also matter, right? Especially when we're talking outside the Western narratives. So sort of the ancestral and the elders' perspective, that kind of bleeds into my next point, ritual and spirituality. Ritual and spirituality is so important. Again, in most of the world, maybe we've forgotten it quite a bit in the Western world, but it is a vital part of people's lives, in almost everywhere across the global south. And again, we need to imagine what does that look like in the future. And not only, it is an interesting challenge, it is also a very visually rich challenge. And when most of entertainment, succeeds or not based on the trailer that it produces, it's very interesting to think, what would rituals look like as supported by future science and technology? And there are multiple other points that I kind of really looked into that dystopia overlooks and protopia has, and how it's important to really think of these evolved futures, not perfect futures, not utopias. It's very hard to believe in utopias. But if we can tackle at least some of these points of the list that I created, and that, my friends and peers and audiences keep adding to, then I think we will start seeing how we can make it happen in our real lives, how we could bring it into our real cities, how those practices could improve, the work within our companies. And so, what are these really concrete takeaways of future imagination? I think is key to think about.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful place to leave things. We've rapidly run out of time. I mean, I could talk to you all day, but to have a concrete idea of the future and where the future can go. And I also wanted to pick up on the lovely point that you made that, women are often depicted as being less intellectually capable. Anyone who's listened to this will know that that's not the case when it comes to you, Monika.
Well, actually, I want to pick on that particular trope, all these movies where, AI is becoming conscious and it is in a form of a female robot. For me, again, if you start peeling off the layers of that skin, you realize that it's not a fear of robots and not a fear of AI. It's a fear of intelligent women.
Ooh.
And if you're intelligent enough, you start being seen as robotic. I think we really need to analyze those kind of stories and really see, I speak a lot how, and that kind of taps in from what we spoke about, having been destructive to needing to become sustainable, to needing to be regenerative. For me, it's also, about decolonizing those future visions. And for me, what colonization and colonialism is about, it's not just a historical phenomenon, it's also a phenomenon that we're living through today. And it is really ultimately about the culture of exploitation, right? And our narratives, our mainstream narratives of success are all based on winner takes all, and having to exploit somebody lesser than you, somebody less privileged than you, in order to build up yourself, in order to be successful. And I guess my key engagement is not just depicting those fanciful futures, but also seeing how we can move from the narrative of, individual, corporate, and civilizational success, anchored in the culture of exploitation, to becoming rooted in a culture of contribution. And how can we make it exciting for people to see how we can contribute to that future landscape that we're building? And what does that mean, in every aspect? And I think it's a really, building up around hope, whilst being aware of all the issues, building around hope rather than fear, and building around the culture of contribution versus exploitation is something that is really, really interesting to explore today. And I think that people really connect deeply with. And been longing for a long time.
Monika, that's wonderful. We're going to finish there with that lovely thought of the culture of contribution. I want to make everybody aware that you are available to speak on these topics at much greater length, of course, than I have given you here today. I think there's great value for clients. And thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.